Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Unerased Book Club discussion. We are really excited to be here with Fatema Haque and Sheela Lal to discuss this evening The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee. This is a YA novel, historical novel. Before we get started with our discussion, I thought we could just introduce ourselves so we know who we're talking with. I am Lucy, and I work at the library as a youth tech. So I do story times and programs and things like that.
My name is Phoebe. I'm a desk clerk at the library, so I'm who helps you out when you come to check out books.
My name is Beth Manuel. I'm in the outreach team of the Ann Arbor District Library, and I can attest that Phoebe does help you out when you're on the desk.
You're muted.
I am unmuted. Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm also a library technician. I work at public desks and I do youth and teen and adult programming. Yep.
I'm Fatema. I use she, her pronouns, and I am president of the board of Rising Voices, a Michigan-based nonprofit that supports Asian Americans' political representation and engagement in the state of Michigan. And behind me is a virtual background of some plants and crows with a city landscape. And I'm a brown Bangladeshi woman.
And I'm Sheela Lal. I'm the founder of Unerased Book Club, but co-facilitator with Fatema. I'm on the board of the C4 side of Rising Voices. Oh, yeah, it looks like it's frozen, but if you can hear me, I think that's all that matters right now. Perfect. I'm on the C4 board of Rising Voices, so I help with direct political engagement on that front. And the reason we bring up Rising Voices is Unerased Book Club is a project of the organization, so they are related. And Lucy, did you introduce yourself? Sorry if I missed that.
Yeah, I did. I started
did.
off.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. Mm-hmm. So the way that I like to open every book club is just asking, how did you feel about the book? And if whoever starts could also give a synopsis, that would be great.
I didn't catch what you said. Whoever starts, but
just give a synopsis so people listening aren't super left out. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, I enjoyed the book. When I read it, I remembered how much I liked historical fiction when I was growing up. And, you know, I sometimes read it, not as often, but I appreciated her voice and her lightheartedness at times. I mean, and just like living in a really difficult situation, but I don't know, I liked her style as a character.
And I could just quickly give a synopsis of the book. So it is historical fiction that takes place in Atlanta in 1890, and the main character is a girl named Jo Kwan, and she is Chinese American, and she lives in a basement space that's sort of a leftover Underground Railroad stop. And she works as a hat maker and then gets involved in writing with a newspaper. And I thought it was really interesting to have this character in this time and place because, you know, there's like this racial divide. You see like the bus, you know, Black people having to sit at the back of the bus and not walk on the sidewalks. And for Jo and other Chinese people, there's not really a specific place where they fit into that, but they are really more almost invisible because of that. So I agree with Beth. I thought she was a really fun character, and I liked some of her expressions and way of talking.
So I loved this book. I think it's always interesting when authors decide to highlight people of color in American history and throughout. One of my favorite books from this year that we've read and discussed was Passage West, because we really got to see Sikh farmers in California during a time period that we hadn't seen before. And this book wasn't any different because it located Chinese Americans in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the South of all places, right? Because we don't often associate Chinese Americans with being in Georgia or just anywhere in the nearby areas. And we got references to them being in Alabama and other places too. So that was really cool. And I loved that we got to see the tension at this really pivotal time in history where a lot of different things were happening, right? The pushback against segregation, like, and integration and all of those things was happening. And then we also got to see just some of the ways in which power was being enacted and taken away from people. So things that people were doing freely, such as where they sat on the bus or where they walked or what they were able to do, was slowly being stripped away. And I really appreciated how much she situated us in that space and kind of helped us think about where the tensions lied between people who were friends and allies and even, got along well amongst things, but then there was a tension brought along because of race and because of some new laws that were happening and how everybody reacts to it differently. And I think it creates very interesting and important interpersonal things. And I just loved it. And I thought I have so many thoughts about it, but I'll pause here for now.
Well, I'll say that I like the book a lot, and I like that I love Jo as a character, and I also like that her name is Jo. I just think of like Little Women and this like tough character. I like that a lot. And what do they call her? A saucebox. I loved her point of view. What drew me to want to read this book for this discussion group was some of the characteristic traits. And I loved how she became this like ghostwriter of an advice column, this like Chinese woman who's a teenager in the South and just is giving this advice, and she's speaking her mind, which she can't really do even in like, other than like being in the house with the other like housemates, she can't really speak her mind that freely. And so that's what drew me to her as the character. So I love that. And I do love that it's teen. I'm not a huge historical fiction person, so it took me a little bit to get into it at the beginning. I mean, it's a pretty breezy, it's breezy, if I can say that. It goes pretty quick. You get introduced to a lot of characters and you're trying to match like who's who and what their relationships are, and you're kind of guessing what is to come. I don't want to bring up the end yet, but I have thoughts about the ending. But I just really liked her as a character. And I do think that I've never really thought about like Asians in the South. Like, so it drew me, like, I want to know what it was like for somebody like her during that time period in that setting. And I think that this book gave me the information, and it sort of gave me everything I was looking for going into the book. So I'm glad I read it.
I really liked it too. I think it like, in a good way, made me more curious about certain things. Like they talk about how Chinese people couldn't own or rent land. And so they were living in this basement that underneath the print shop that the print shop owners didn't know about. But I'm like, okay, but what did everybody else do? And the people who lived with them who moved away, where did they go and what are they doing? So it was just like, it planted all these seeds where I was like, okay, and not to ruin the ending either, but like things that happened in the end made me think, oh, and the stuff that was said in the beginning, it makes you think about all those different things differently. It was so good. I enjoyed it so much.
And then to contextualize for our listeners and for everybody on this call, the reason we listed this book was because, yes, it's a YA book that doesn't succumb to some of the same tropes that we're used to seeing in YA literature. It also, like everyone has said, is very stark in the fact that, like, yes, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans have been here for a very long time, but we don't see any stories centering that, and very, very few stories normalizing it. It's always seen as like exotic, but like Jo's just existing, and she has a very strong personality. And I found that to be incredibly endearing, that any child reading or teenager reading this book doesn't feel like they have to be exceptional, or like the character has to be exceptional or whatever to be seen as like a full character. And I just thought that was really fun. And I found that the like mysterious angle to the like her plot was a very interesting way of positioning this character for readers. So I found the book really enjoyable when first when I read it. That's why we picked it. And really thinking about it in the aftermath of the murders in Atlanta earlier this year. No, last year. Sorry, time has no meaning. That's really, it really like hit home just how important it is to show different characters in all parts of the country, to reiterate that none of us are foreign. The perpetual foreign idea isn't helping anybody and is actually very harmful.
I also like the way that this book like was dealing with racism and sexism and segregation and these sort of shadow lives and these invisible people, but at the same time it really was a joy to read. I mean, so I thought that balance was really nice. I appreciated that, but it doesn't shy away from like the reality of what was happening, but you still find yourself laughing, or I did.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting when I was reading it, because these are heavy topics that were happening to people who existed in that place at that time, but yet it didn't feel as heavy as some other books that are historical, dealing with racism in the South, Black, white, Asian. And so I thought that was really interesting that it felt not fluffy or light, but sort of breezy, like it was an easy read. But I liked how all of the characters, or many of the characters, had these little like one-liner pieces of advice where this was the thing. And I loved the bicycles. And I love that the women riding bicycles was so empowering. What do they call them? Safeties.
Safeties.
I liked that, because it was a fun way to show like progression, or this thing that they wanted to do because they wanted to do it. You know, they were making the rules before somebody else made it up for them, as one of the characters alludes to. So just bicycles.
I think part of what makes like I don't think that there's any instances of racism that is extremely egregious, right? It's often stays in the space of microaggressions, meaning like small everyday interactions that people face and that's very routine and they're used to. And I appreciated that was just kind of strewn throughout, because it doesn't hide the reality in which these folks live in, but at the same time, you can notice the impact of that, right? So when they aren't able to sit near the heater in the rail car, and how someone loses their sense of dignity in that space, and what happens, or during the women's meeting, when they are obviously contributing to it, but are told that they can only participate to certain degrees, or it's not their fight. Again, that loss of dignity that happens, yet people keep moving forward and keep finding ways to take a stand, or to continue on in their life in a way that is meaningful to them. I think there's also power behind that. So I appreciated how woven it was into it. And I felt very much like I could picture their life really clearly, which I loved. Yeah.
I also liked, on that note, how she kept mentioning how whenever she walked by someone, they would give her like a confused turned disgusted look, and just how regular that was. And I liked when she said, I should start charging them to ogle me like that. I was like, yes, yes, you should.
Are we gonna end up talking about the end, or?
Yeah, again, like if people are watching, spoiler alert, we've all read the book.
Yeah, I mean, earlier this year I read The Kite Runner, and there's a real similar twist, except in The Kite Runner, the parent, wasn't such a horrible person to the offspring, you know, the unknown offspring. You know, I mean, this woman was just, she was horrible. It's really, really hard for me to conceptualize somebody having a child and not acknowledging them. That's just, it's really hard for me to contend with. But so, I mean, by the end, I just thought, well, God, she's really bad, you know? But, well, there's no but. She was not a good person. But I did enjoy how, like, Joe's attempt at trying to figure out what her background was and the clues that she was finding, and the secret to, you know, why her father left. But still, I just had a bad taste in my mouth about that old biddy, the mom. So.
Yeah, I had a lot of dislike for the daughter, Caroline. She just was, I put more of my, even though the mother did that eventually, we meet Caroline and meet her and all her reasons first. And she's just a terrible person. I just had a hard time. But I also, since they were close in age, and then since they knew each other their whole lives, I feel like there was this little sisterly, like, peer thing they could do, but also they hated each other. And she even acknowledges this when she knows the truth of who her parents are. And for me, I was thinking about the mother. She chose to be a pain, and she chose her status and her home and her husband over, like, how to handle this child. But she also wanted to protect the child because she says, oh, I had a boy and not instead of a girl, which is, you know, so she lied to him. He thinks so there was that, not that I'm saying she was a good person, Beth, but she made her choice, you know, she thought about it and she made the choice that, you know, she wanted to keep her little family in a box the way it was, and she wanted to be a pain. She wanted that status and that money. But also I wonder, as the truth comes out over Joe being her daughter, and I don't know if we want to unpackage that yet, but how that, like, crumple or, like, wrinkles out through the rest of the town and, like, the print shop family. And I wanted more to that. I wanted more. I felt like there should have been way more, like, panic and freakouts and drama behind that. And it was just sort of like, just, you know, ironed out a little bit smoothly. I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, as we're talking about this, it does hit me how multiracial children are very much exoticized now. And I'm very curious what that looked like then, when obviously integration was not acceptable. And even more than that, having multiracial children out of wedlock was a no-no, and triply so if you were a white woman. And I'm just curious, like, what does passing look like then? Because we have so many different types of Asian Americans now that you can kind of tell when people are from multiracial families and whatnot. And I don't know what it would be like in Atlanta in 1890 to see multiracial kids, whether they're white, black, white Asian, or white, in this case, white Chinese. And, like, how did that not give it away that she wasn't, that she may be from one of these families?
Mm-hmm.
I thought the Billy Riggs was his name.
Mm-hmm.
Him being related to Noemi. Is that her name?
Yeah, I think that's how
Sorry.
I'm not sure how to say it.
Yeah, them being half siblings, and then him passing as a white person, and then that's another thing, which I thought was really interesting. And, like, speaking of, like, mixed people, I think that's really interesting because I'm a quarter Japanese and I look totally different from my sister, and my sister would totally pass as totally 100% white, whereas people are kind of like, what are you to me? So yeah, I thought that was so interesting. And then how Joe was like, well, now I can see their features that look the same because the eye wants to see what it wants to see. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's really interesting too. Mm-hmm. Also, I kind of loved Caroline. and how they like
too.
hate each other. I also have two sisters, and so I'm like, they were giving me sister vibes the entire time, and I was like, I want them to be frenemies, and then they were. And then how old Jin was like, I wanted you to have at least this relationship after your parents go, even if you can't find peace with who your parents are. Like, I want you to have the sibling, which I thought was really cute. And I was like, yeah. And then I was kind of disappointed when in the end she was like, I don't know that I'll ever have a good relationship with her, but like, I'm okay with like being content where we are right now. And I'm like, no, be best friends. I really like them.
They might get there.
They might. I mean, by the end, I mean, Caroline was, you know, asking about like riding a bike, not me to bring up the bikes again, but she seems like she's going to relax a little bit or become more understanding. And because she has already says she doesn't need to be married, and now she's looking like, well, do you think she'll show me how to ride a bicycle? So little things are showing like Caroline is feeling a little bit of empowerment coming from somewhere. And I think if you want to picture like the two sisters, Caroline and Joe, like maybe they'll be frenemies, maybe they'll, you know, have more of a sisterly relationship. But even like if you consider any kind of sister relationship, not everything is perfect, but you're there because you have to be, you know. And I still want to think and hope and wish that there is that for them in their future, from what we saw with Caroline at the end.
Yeah, I think that with Caroline, Joe was the only person who really saw her, right? And that moment came out during the conversation with Caroline's dad, where Joe advocated for Caroline and said, you should, you know, like believe in your daughter more, and you should give her more responsibilities and think of her strongly. And so for Caroline to have that kind of validation and affirmation from someone who doesn't like her and who she's treated really terribly, but who ultimately, you know, as far as I could tell from the book, was the only person who saw her for what she could be. I thought that was really interesting. And that probably is what softened her to Joe. And it might just take a while to sink in for her, and hopefully to treat her better and become a better person. But I enjoyed that dynamic quite a bit.
Yeah, I did too. And I also appreciated that, like, even though in the beginning, Caroline is awful to her and Mrs. Payne is really awful to her. I mean, she's essentially employing her own daughter, you know, but that they were also fully realized characters, so that you could understand eventually when you get to the end of the book why some of their behaviors cropped up. And not that it necessarily meant to elicit sympathy, but I just think to show that whole picture of what might make someone act the way they act.
Yeah, even though I didn't care for Caroline, I did like their relationship, and the kind of blackmailing that or what bartering that Joe had to employ. She was really smart. I liked her too.
Joe was very smart, and I love the way that she knew she had to keep that job because she wanted money. She wanted to support her father, grandfather figure, old Jin. Like, she wanted to support him in any way she could. And so she knew she had to withstand, like, you know, this verbal abuse from Caroline. But she also knew she had a bit of an upper, because she wasn't, like, Joe was not dumb. Joe was smart, and she knew how to do the blackmail. She knew how to, like, work it a little bit, even though she, like, in her heart of hearts, she would have just, like, told them off and ran. But she wanted to support old Jin, who had supported her whole life.
I just want to step back a little bit and reflect on how little we are taught about Reconstruction and Jim Crow era in its totality. And that, to me, is always so shocking when I read books set in periods of time or places in time that are not seen as important enough for mainstream American education to be part of, like, how we view our own history. And even small things like the bicycles being seen as a tool of empowerment, or the the encroaching policy around who can sit where on the bus. Because we don't understand that in our education, it is so jarring to read as a casual matter of fact, and then, like, reflecting on what that looks like now. And how, in the case of Caroline, representing very much like the restrictions placed on white women, and then Joe, like just not being able to live in a proper home because of restrictions placed on Chinese Americans, and then thinking now about how policies are written by very specific groups of people with very specific end aims. And even though we have the internet, we have all these opportunities for people's voices to be positively heard, we still get such a restrictive form of imagination in terms of how policy impacts groups of people or people with specific experiences. And I'm not sure where I'm ending this train of thought, but I think that that's the lasting impact of this book on me as a reader.
I thought a place where that history was also really interestingly realized was with the suffragette movement. I mean, I think that when we learn that in history, that to me, it seems like it's kind of glossed over, like, yay, women were doing this thing. And I love that Stacey Lee is showing us honestly how it was white women working for white women. And they're actually saying like, no, it's not really your turn. Like we're going to do this now for us. And that kept coming up. And I loved that was in there to show us what was really happening. And it's like the Jim Crow and the encroaching segregation and all those things. There's no info dumping for us in this book. You know, we don't get like these whole pages of explanations, but you are getting the history just through the daily interactions. So I thought she wove all that in really well.
Yeah, and she even there's the callback to Sojourner Truth and the Ain't I a Woman, the bit of speech, which I thought was really brilliant, but to show the intersectionality of that movement, because we always just hear, oh, women got the right to vote in this, but we, it's often failed to mention that it was white women who received the vote. And then there was also the tension of how the movement also saw how Black men were voting or not voting, and the whole accusation around them selling their votes and giving that away. So I really, really appreciated those tensions, because as you mentioned, Sheela, we don't get that in our history books. We don't see it in detail. We're just not taught that this is how reality was shaped. And I am like, when I read something like this, where I see how incrementally the laws change, I think so much about how we are constantly introducing laws or have laws on the book that are restrictive to people, that are harmful to people. And we kind of go along with it. We just like adjust to it. We figure out a way around it, or we like just passively go on with it because it doesn't directly affect us. And without recognizing that it affects so many people. And I'm thinking specifically about how some of the rules that are being passed in other states right now that are impacting women across the board, especially women of color.
It also reminds me of what's going on with critical race theory, and seeing the school districts that aren't allowed to teach certain concepts. You're right. Laws continue to be made to keep down certain people and or elevate certain, white people, really. The thing about the suffragettes, though, what I thought of while I was reading, actually, I listened to the book, and it's been a couple months since I listened, so I don't remember all the details, but anyway, their depiction of the Black women suffragettes and how they were separating them was similar to what I'd learned recently about the civil rights movement too, and women's liberation. And I mean, again, this from TV, movie, or whatever, but still, I know it was based on fact that that the women's liberation ERA, it was started, for white women too. And I think Black women have, been able to get get involved, get into it, back in the 60s, 70s, but it wasn't with an open arm, like as it was depicted in the book. There's separation.
Mm-hmm. Well, even when they were at the suffragist meeting and then the people of color were put in one little corner of the room and they made their list of, what do they call them? They made their little list. And then when one of the other women came inside and they said, well, those are your problems. Those are colored people problems. Those aren't our problems. They said, no, these are our problems. We are women. We are half of the population. They're like, no. They shut it down because it involved more than just being a woman. And they're like, but no, these are my problems and we are women. I didn't fit in that box of, well, these are for white people, not you. That's why I liked with Jo having her Miss Sweetie character. She was able to bring so many of these things to the attention of everybody, the blacks, the whites, every little nook who they were coming across this paper. Like even old Jin saw it in the stable, like, and he knew it was her, but it was a way to like address like being single, not getting married, riding a bicycle, like it, or even like with the rights to vote. Like there was one where a reader had commented on women having their menstrual time, and then her response was, well, the alternative is worse, but they get to vote. So I just love these little, they're really big jabs at like society and the things people in that town that she was mingling were doing. So it was just a way to bring up those topics and to have other people like a buzz about what was being said and to sort of kind of change their, not the oppressors, but the people who were feeling oppressed, like, hey, I don't have to do that. Maybe I can do that. So I like that the author's way of doing it. And that's one of the things that drew me to wanting to read the book, was that somebody was bucking the system. I love characters who do that. And I think that the Miss Sweetie character, she just really was able to bring in some of those pieces, which was a lot of fun.
And I liked how she used Miss Sweetie for herself personally outside of her writing to empower herself, when she was like, no, it's not Jo, it's Miss Sweetie, and I can do this. And so, she's helping herself in other ways, and she's influenced people, and she's actually changing people's minds with this column, but then it also keeps giving her this inside sort of power. So I just loved that dynamic between her own two characters.
Has anyone read this author before? Stacey Lee?
I hadn't. This was my first novel of hers, but then I did read another one of her books. The name escapes me right now, but it's set in Westward Expansion.
She has another one. Yeah. There was another one. I think it came on one of the reading lists last year, and I put it on my to-be read list. I think it's called Luck of the Titanic by her. And again, I'm not into historical, and I thought, I'm gonna, go outside of my box and read something historical. And I would like to read more about the Titanic. And I thought, why not do it in a YA book that's centered on an Asian person? But I just haven't gotten time to read it. And so when this book came across the table, the premise drew me in, and I was like, oh, that's the author who wrote The Luck of the Titanic. So that also drew me in. So has anybody read that one?
I just picked it up from the library yesterday, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I've become a fan of her writing. I read, after I finished reading this book, I checked out Outrun the Moon, and I read that very quickly too. That takes place in 1906, San Francisco, during the big earthquake that happens. And it's also really, really excellent, has very strong female characters, as you might assume from a writer like this, and just, again, locates Chinese folks in that particular time in history in San Francisco. And I just loved it. So I'm looking forward to reading her two other books, and I will most definitely read them all.
Yeah, that's how I feel. I want to read them all. I really liked her writing, and it's like I want to go back into, if not this world, then another world similar, please. Yeah,
absolutely a fan. Yeah.
What I find really exceptional about the two books I've read and the characters in them is there's minimal pining for an idea of home that isn't the US, and that's a very rare feature in Asian American writing. There's, at least in a lot of the books that I've read, the main character has some sort of tension with how do you explain away where you came from to the people you live with now, or what, some sort of variation on that. And again, because it's set so long ago, if you're coming across land and sea, you have made, whether by choice or not, like there's a complete disruption in how you view what is home, and you can't romanticize it because you're not going back. And you just got to keep the characters in both Downstairs Girl and the other book whose name I can't remember right now. Their tension is with themselves and like the situation around them and the society around them, not having to explain away their Chineseness, which is a very refreshing take.
You know, I think, by the way, the book Under a Painted Sky, I think. Yeah. And, but I hadn't thought about that until you just said it, that there isn't that nostalgia for the homeland. In fact, even when the homeland is brought up, it's brought up as this unknown space, but not necessarily a desire to know the space, which, yeah, that's super interesting that doesn't happen. Like these characters are very much comfortably situated and owning their Americanness, which you don't see as much in modern characters. That's really cool.
Yeah, I remember thinking that as I was listening, just some of the scenes where, you know, she's just walking down the street, and I reflected on that, and just that it just seemed like such a normal, it was normal, you know, living in Atlanta. She just happened to not be able to do what everyone else is able to do because of her being Chinese. But, you know, she had a place in the community. She had relationships, and she was known, you know, and I liked how it was just it wasn't, yeah, like her Chineseness wasn't like a thing that really separated her. I don't know if I'm like it. She just was still part of the community, and I liked that too. I would recommend this book, and will do so for young readers who come in to the library.
Yeah, and it's not like it's a subtraction. It's not like the lack of conversation dilutes her character, lack of conversation about her being Chinese. It's more, there's like so much information she has. She like is proud of that part, but recognizes that like there's other things to her besides her ethnic identity. Her ethnic identity does not make up her personality. It is a component, not the full. And that's like, that's what I think is so cool, is like you can be seen as a complete character, and like for young readers to come in and see that your ethnic or cultural identity is cool, but doesn't have to be the end all be all of who you are, is a very important representation to have available.
I did like when we open up the book and she's working in the hat shop and she's really good at making the knots. Like that Chinese girl can make knots better than anybody else, but she still gets canned for other reasons. And then I did like towards the end when Old Jin, his knots were even better than hers. So I like that there's that small piece of like craft and culture that she's good at, and other people can't do it because it was passed down to her from where she comes from. So that kind of ties into what you were speaking of.
If it's okay, I'd like to go back to the passing conversation, because I think that during that time period, there was a lot of people who integrated, right? A lot of communities, and particularly because of immigration rules, right? When I read Bengali Harlem, it talked about a similar time period where a lot of Bengali men who came as coolies on ships ended up in Atlanta, in New York, in New Jersey, all of those spaces. And they found homes in Puerto Rican communities, in Black communities, and intermarried. And then we saw similar things happen in Passage West with like Mexican and Indian Sikh men marrying. And now we're seeing it here where they're Chinese immigrants were not allowed because of the law. Like they couldn't reunite with their families, women couldn't come and join men. And so it was really hard for them to build families within their own communities or cultures. And they either had to intermarry, if that was even a possibility, which we didn't delve too deeply into, but obviously there was interracial romances in the book, or it ended really disastrously, as in the case of the mom. And then those who could ended up either passing as a particular race as opposed to trying to hold that multiracial space. And I just am so curious about that decision, right? About how do you like, I'm forgetting the name of the man, who passed as white, but we later learned that he,
it's Billy Riggs, I think.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
Billy Riggs, right? So like the Billy Riggs, and then and Jo not even knowing, and when she does, she knows that she is still very much situated as a Chinese person and not as a white passing person. And I feel like this is also a conversation that's very big right now because of the Vanishing Half, or Netflix's new series Passing, that's coming out soon, and things like that. So just wanted to open that back up again if folks wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, I just finished The Vanishing Half last week. I thought it was really good. And prior to that, we read Passing. We've had a book discussion, and I know it's coming on to Hulu, I think. But yeah, I guess because I listened to the book before I read the other ones, I hadn't really thought about the idea of passing, except the Billy Riggs part of it. It was, again, there's so much, it's hard to remember what I was thinking and listening to, but yeah, that's right. I'd forgotten about Billy Riggs and his passing. And so I don't know the point there, just yeah, it's still prevalent in society. I mean, maybe, I don't know. Are people passing? I don't know. Maybe I said that, and then I don't know if it's true. I suppose that could be.
Yeah, it's just such like an odd concept of like, first, like, do people have a lack of imagination to assume that if you look one way, you can't culturally affiliate somewhere else? And also this like very American idea that the idea of whiteness is what we should all aspire to anyways, and that idea of passing. And that, again, like, it's such a limited scope of what phenotypes actually turn out to be like. Because like on the flip side of passing for white, because I'm white skinned and just brown, I pass for, quote unquote, pass for so many other types of cultures. Like growing up, a lot of people, including Mexican Americans, assumed I was Mexican. I lived in Dearborn for a little bit. Many people thought I was Palestinian, which I did not realize was such a specific way to look, but there's that. And then when I'm in India, in any part of South Asia, really, I just am assumed to be from a different part that's not there because my language skills are so bad. They're like, you can't possibly be from this part. I'm like, perfect. As long as you're not going to charge me like 10 times the price, I'm good with this. But the idea of passing in this context is so bizarre to me. But Phoebe, if you would like to share, I would love to hear more about what that means for you and your sisters.
It's interesting. I have two sisters. The oldest one and I look a lot alike. People ask if we're twins, even though we're 7 years apart. And the other one looks totally different. So it's interesting how my sister Lainey and I have always gotten, what are you? And so, and I could say anything and they'll agree with me. or like, or people will tell me I'm wrong, which is really interesting a lot, because especially in the summer, I get very dark. And so people have always been like, oh, so you're half Black, right? That's like something people assume a lot. Even people who have met both of my parents. And I have to be like, no, they're like, oh, well, I don't think you're, and I'm like, why? Just because it doesn't fit what they're already thinking in their head. Or a lot of people like you like assume that I'm Mexican American when I'm not. But truly, they will believe anything, which is fascinating. Yeah, it's really weird.
I had the exact same experience as Sheela did when I was in Asia. I mean, it's never happened in America because I'm very vocally, I'm Bangladeshi American, like that's my opening line. But in Asia, I was frequently mistaken for all the other countries except for the one where I'm from. And even in Bangladesh, I would not be considered, oh, are you Bangladeshi? Unless I was in my particular district, which speaks a dialect of Bangla that I am fluent in, and so can reasonably pass as myself, right? But otherwise, everybody else. And sometimes it afforded me a lot of privilege. I think so. The conversation of passing connects with the conversation around privilege, right? Yeah. Or either having it or not having it. And for me, I took advantage of the fact that I could pass as a foreigner in Bangladesh because it meant that people, often men, would leave me alone, right? So I would go to the market and I would be buying my groceries and things like that. And I wouldn't have to get into this extended conversation about why I, as a Bangladeshi woman, was doing my own shopping, because typically what happens is you either, like there are people who sell vegetables and things, they go up and down. You can just literally call down from your apartment and say, hold on. And they'll stop in front of your apartment. You buy your groceries right there, or you send your household help, whoever that happens to be there, or you send a male family member, or you go with a child, which again, then you're a married woman with a child who's going to the market. So the fact that I, a single woman by herself, was shopping for my own groceries at a market, because I'm not home in the morning. I work. I am not there to wait for the vegetable guy to come by. Like, none of that is happening. People have a lot of questions, and I got to avoid that. And I got to avoid a whole slew of interrogation on a daily basis. And that worked in my favor. And that was the privilege I got to carry because I spoke with an accent. Yeah.
I think too, when you think about someone who passes as something else, they choose the one that does give them the benefit or the thing, or I can get that scholarship now because I have, an eighth of Native American me, or I remember that coming up when I was in high school. And some people didn't want to do that. And then teachers would encourage them, well, yes, you are. So why not do the thing? But it's something that, even if it's simple as being able to go to the market in peace, it's still something that you valued, or, you know what I mean? So it's more of like passing to get the thing. It's interesting.
I also think it's interesting that it's like what kind of society has told you, because I also, being ambiguous and looking mostly white, another thing that happens is when I do say I'm a quarter Japanese, they're like, that doesn't really count. That's not enough. Yeah. And so then you internalize that and you think, okay, so I am just white. I'm not this. And then, so like I found out only recently that my mom, who is half Japanese, when like filling out forms, was only checking white. And I had to be like, why? Like, you can check both. You should be checking both. And so that's something interesting where it's like, oh, I don't even think to do that because this is what has always been told I should be doing. Mm-hmm. And this is like what is preferred for most people. But so then I always feel like, since people say, oh, that's not enough, you're not. So I don't feel like I can say that I am, Asian American. And so it's like something I have to retrain my brain to think is like, yes, you are, and that's enough. Even if you are passing as a white person, this is also a part of who you are.
Mm-hmm. It's also things. Oh, go ahead. Oh, this is a perfect time to plug Rising Voices yet again. Rising Voices is for anybody who identifies as Asian American, not just people who have either grown up in an Asian American community or are quote unquote visibly Asian American, whatever that means. This is especially important for transracial adoptees or children in multiracial families, that we accept all. And then my second point was that I've been trying myself to move away from saying mixed and saying multiracial, to like recognize that all forms of racial or ethnic identity are valid, and it's not about cutting them into pieces to make it fit 100%. They're all 100%. It's just a matter of what anybody feels comfortable expressing or identifying with.
Awesome. We're kind of rounding on the hour, and I'm just curious if there were any other moments that particularly stood out to people or that we didn't get a chance to discuss that you're like, I wish I had talked about that.
Something sorry. I just want to quickly say that another reason that I would definitely recommend this book to people is I think the writing is really great. And like some moments, like Jo has a line at the end about stepping out from the shadows under her hat. And I just thought that was such a good way to, like, she starts in this hat shop and she ends with this line about shadows, and there's so many shadows in this book that she's kind of hidden in. And there's another line, I can't remember it exactly, but it was something about Monday morning comes in like a rooster in a fight, or I don't know, just like there's these occasional bits of writing where I just was like, oh, wow, and so I just think as a young adult novel, it's great to see something that's really well written as well. That's all I want to say.
I agree. Also, one big thing that I thought was interesting was when they talk about the Chinese man with rabbit eyes who raped the woman in the cemetery. And I wrote in it, did he violate her or was he just not white? And then we later learn it's to cover up the mom. And oh God, so exciting. It's like, this was all just for you, lady.
Yeah, and that they hung a random dude. He's fine. He'll be a good substitute. Yeah. We know it's not the person.
It's taken care of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
there's a lot going on in this book. There's a lot like what you just said. That's a whole other 20-minute conversation. Like there's so much going on.
Or the mom. Sorry. Like after we learn that that's her mom, when she starts working for them again, and her pulling her aside and being like, so you're not on the same level as Caroline, right? You know your place because you're not equals. And then you think that she said that as her mom being like, you guys aren't equals. That also gets you afterwards.
Yeah, that ain't right. I was just, one thing that I was curious about was because I'm Jewish, but was Nathan Jewish? Were the print family Jewish? Did they say they were, or there was an allusion to it? I don't remember. But yeah, they didn't specify it, but it could have been. And there was some talk. I mean, there were mentions of Jewish people, Jews, but I don't remember if he was specifically. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting. He was a nice guy.
And I did wonder too with the Bells and with Nathan, the folks in the print shop who Jo and old Jen were squatting in their basement for years and years, and now they're commingling with the family upstairs. They set up the space downstairs for them. Jo and Nathan are off smooching. Like how, like the town sees, maybe they don't see, like Jo and Nathan are still a secret, but they see these people coming in and out of the front door. It's not a secret that they're in the basement now. So I was wondering how that is like accepted, like what is being talked about, or how are they defending it, or how are they just like describing like, oh yes, they live with us, or oh, we're, you know what I mean? I know that that Jo is going to start working for them, as she's actually going to have her name in the paper, or eventually she's still going to write as Miss Sweetie, but she'll get paid for her work. So I think that was very cool. But I just wonder about their like inevitable like familial relationship. Like Jo says like, oh yes, I finally have a family, but how was that seen? I just wondered how it was viewed like in the rest of the community.
I would fully take a sequel
I
of
was
this
just gonna
book,
say,
you
yeah.
know, to
Yep.
get the story of like Joe and Nathan, and how does it work, or does it not work, or you know,
Yeah.
are they continuing to live in the margins and the shadows? So,
well, they mentioned like Atlanta. They can't be together in Atlanta. Atlanta doesn't have Chinese people, but Augusta does, or something.
mhm.
Don't they say something like that?
Yes, I think so.
Well, I just want to think that Miss Sweetie is still writing columns and giving advice to women everywhere. They can wear pants and ride bikes, and you know, if the Chinese girl can ride a horse and win, so can you. And I think too, for a YA novel, like someone mentioned that it doesn't fall into all the YA tropes. For me, it totally had the cheesy, sappy, like happy ending that you see in a lot of teen books, which is not a bad thing. Like if you're reading a 400-page or pushing a 400-page like teen novel, like if you're a kid, you want to have that, you know, that ending. For me, the ending was very fast. A lot of pieces happened. All things came together. But it worked in a weird way for this to have it all kind of wrapped up, since even though you had so many heavy topics going on, you weren't focused on one specific thing the whole time. So for me, I think as a YA novel, I think having things wrapped up worked. It was still a little too tied up for me in a perfect little bow, but it worked for the way the story was written and like the direction of where the characters were going. And like you wanted to think Joe was just like riding off into the sunset on that horse, you know?
Yeah. Outrun the Moon is not the same. There will be moments where you're going to throw the book across the room because it is heartbreaking, but it also has the happy ending, just, you know, a lot of stuff thrown in the middle.
I think that's kind of a good hallmark of a young adult, like what it differentiates maybe a young adult book from an adult book, because the subject matter doesn't have to be different. It can be equally as heavy and involved, but I think there's just that hopeful ending at the end of a YA book. Well, I really am so glad that you picked this book, because I had a lot of fun reading it. So thank you. We're just about at an hour. So it was really nice to have this discussion. And thank you once again, Fatema and Sheela, for facilitating it for us. And yeah, we'll be back for another one.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. Next month, we are reading Gates by Sahar Muradi, and it is poetry. So hopefully more folks join us.
Yeah.